So, welcome everyone to the August 2020 meeting for the Australia and New Zealand PowerShell and DevOps user group. Should probably add that to the front slide there. We've got a bunch of social media and meetup links, but the main one to be aware of is our anzpsug.github.io. That links through to everything, including upcoming meetings, and the like. So organising this meeting is myself. I'm Josh King down here in New Zealand, and across in Australia we've got Adam and Shah. If you're interested at all in presenting, or you've got requests for topics or anything like that, feel free to reach out to any of us individually, or all of us, or the main ANZPSUG handle. I did want to call out an event that's coming up soon, and that is a joint effort between, I believe, all of the main PowerShell conference groups that have now sort of had to cancel their in-person meetings. So there's going to be a global PowerShell and DevOps conference online. It's a 24-hour live stream. The CFP for that opens on the 15th of August and then closes a month later. I think I got those months the right way around. Yeah. And the event is on the 15th of October. It's free because it's going to be streamed on Twitch and YouTube. And sessions can be live or pre-recorded, but if they're pre-recorded, the person doing it will be in chat to interact a bit. And of course, because it's 24 hours, the speakers are going to need to be worldwide, and I'd encourage anyone here, if they're keen, to submit a topic. There's a really long link here that goes to a blog post with more information about it. There is a shorter link that they mention in that blog post, but it's not live yet, so I unfortunately couldn't include that. But tonight we have Sarah Lean talking on from pushing server cage nuts to pushing code. Sarah, if you want to take over presenting.
Awesome, thank you, Josh. Let me share my presentation. They keep moving all the buttons for everything in Teams. So as Josh said, this session is going to be called From Pushing Server Cage Nuts to Pushing Code, and I think that title kind of encapsulates the journey that I've had recently over the last few years from where I started. So when I came out of university, I went into that traditional first or second level help desk kind of support role that I'm sure you're all maybe familiar with. I was that person at the other end of the phone that reset your password when you forgot it, or helped log a fault for your printer, or, you know, I did get those phone calls where people were saying my PC monitor isn't turning on, and after a few questions realised they were actually trying to tell me that the power had all gone out in their building and that's why their PC wasn't turning on. So I had those variety of calls, and it really helped me understand customer service as well as the technical role, because back when I was doing this, and it feels like a long time ago, even though it was maybe only 14 or 15 years ago, there wasn't the technology that we currently have today. So a lot of the even remote control software that we have the ability now to drive other people's desktops when we're not sitting beside them wasn't available, and all the phone calls were logged through phone calls, so it was just somebody's voice that I was listening to, and I had to try to figure out everything. So it was a bit of a baptism of fire joining that role, but I think it was a great place to start with. I learned, like I said, great customer service skills, and I learned a lot about technology as well. I had a massive variety of calls and technologies, and Yes, we often had that moment where we had to tell people to turn things back on and off. But again, it reiterated all the fundamentals that come with IT. Even now, when we're solving those complex issues that involve several different servers, several different providers, all of those things, it kind of reiterated the fundamentals of IT and how you should address every problem. And like I said, it touched on a variety of technologies. So I've been exposed to a mass range of technologies. I often joke that I've touched every Microsoft product that is probably out there in the market, because that's very much where my expertise or career has focused on, Microsoft technologies. And although some of the pictures on the screen represent things that we maybe don't have anymore, hopefully nobody's running Windows 7 and Server 2008 anymore, but those technologies are still very relevant today. So the knowledge that I have focusing on how to build a server, how to run a server, still translates into what we do nowadays, even though we're using something like, again, hopefully Windows Server 2019, the latest technology. And even things like Exchange Server. Now, I know we probably don't run, or the majority of us don't run Exchange servers on-prem anymore, and it's now in Office 365 or Microsoft 365, depending on what we're calling it nowadays. But the fundamentals of running email, of maintaining that, of interacting with users, coping with what they need. On that picture, I've even got a printer there. So being able to make your printer send emails to yourself if you scan something, all of that fundamental technology was things that I learned and things that I can still use today, right? Although we all go for paperless offices nowadays, still people need to scan, right? They need to print things off occasionally. So the technology around that is pretty much the same. It's just that we're pointing it to a different Exchange server. And things like Active Directory, again, lots of people are probably familiar with Active Directory. It's the authentication protocol that we probably all use. It's still relevant today. We might start to leverage things like Azure AD and B2C and all that kind of good stuff that resides in Azure. But underneath all of that is still the key principles. We have to have a username, a password, or some kind of authentication method. We might even have 2 or 3 passwords to get in through that with MFA and stuff like that. But a lot of those principles are still there. So I have a great foundational level of IT knowledge, because those first level and second level roles really helped me build that up and get a lot of exposure to lots of different technologies. So after serving my time as a first and second level engineer, I started to progress and started to get a bit more responsibility. So I started to look at actually being the person that would be solving the massive problems that the help desk couldn't fix, or even designing systems for companies. So over my time as a consultant with a lot of managed service providers, I have held different SME roles. So I've been an Exchange expert, I've been an SCCM expert. I remember having to deploy that for an airport here in Scotland once. I've done various different roles. I've been that consultant that either specialises in one piece of software or specialises or looks at the general picture of everything. And I think because I've had such a great exposure using those first and second level roles, that the consultant's role was a bit easier for me in terms of that, because I understood how some of these technologies all work together and understand where the users got the benefits and where they didn't. And I also had that aspect of knowing how the support teams use them and some of the known problems that they always come up against, and kind of helped use that. Now, it was probably a lot subconsciously. I was designing systems based on all of that knowledge, but again, it helped me work through all of that. And I'm a big believer that when you join an IT department, you should either start at the bottom or get exposure to working on those help desk and support roles. I've worked in some organisations where people have came in and they do rotations. So 1 week they're on the help desk, 1 week they're doing the second level, and they kind of rotate for the first 3 or 4 months of being in the IT department. And not only does it get you exposure to the technologies, but it also gives you access to some of the end users, some of the stakeholders within your business, and you get to know the people that you can ask for favours if you need them, or the people that are maybe the troublemakers within your organisation, and you understand where all of that sits. So there's lots of value in all of these roles. I know there might not be a lot of money for your salary in some of these roles, but it does give you a lot of value in terms of building up your career exposure and connections as well. Now, I spent a lot of time in data centres, some looking like the ones in the pictures, some not. I've had memorable experiences in the data centre. I definitely was that person that loved being able to just walk into a server room that was sitting next to my desk, or being able to walk into, a third party providers and having that access to the servers, whether that be to check how configuration is plugged in, or whether it be actually installing them and fighting with those server cage nuts. And like I said, I've got memorable stories, lots of weekends lost trying to tidy up cables like in that picture, and lots of evenings and nights spent trying to patch servers and fight with the servers as well. So there's definitely a bit of a scary time when people were starting to look at moving away from all of this, because I was a bit of a hardware geek. I could often tell you the prices of a server and tell you the configuration of a server for a lot of the well-known servers. So I think a lot of the companies I worked for bought HP servers. So I knew how to configure them. I knew the options. I knew the model numbers. Like I said, I knew some of the pricing. So I was a bit of a hardware geek. And when people were starting to think about, oh, we're moving away to the cloud, we won't have hardware on-prem, it's going to be a thing of the past, I started to get a bit scared about where my career was going to go and whether my career was going to come to an end, because my specialist things, the things that I built my career on, were stopping ultimately. Now, it hasn't quite transposed that way. We haven't quite got rid of all of our on-prem environments, and a lot of people are now going hybrid. So it's not quite as scary as I thought it was going to be a few years ago. But at the time, like I said, I was a bit scared about what was going to happen. So I decided to take the plunge and I moved to a company that specialised in the cloud. All they did was cloud deployments. Now, it was a small company. There was about 4 or 5 of us in the company, and they all focused on delivering Azure projects, or Microsoft 365 adoptions. And like I said, it was a bit of a scary move and a risky move for me to move into this. But my role in that company was to be that person that knew the on-prem environments. Their existing engineer had Azure experience and Microsoft 365 experience, but he hadn't ever used on-prem environments. In fact, he hadn't even used Server 2008. So there was big gaps in his skill set. And when he started to talk to customers about migrating away up into the cloud, he didn't have the experience and that knowledge of talking to them. So I was going to be that bridge, and we were going to upskill each other on the various different things. So I thought it was a good move, and yeah, it kind of turned out to be a good move. We worked on some Microsoft 365 projects. Working with our local kind of councils or municipals, we were getting them to adopt Microsoft 365. So initially the projects were all about taking their email servers from on-prem and putting them into the cloud. But as you may know, when you're adopting 365, you don't really get the value if you're just doing that alone. So you have to think about the ecosystem and trying to drive some of the other adoptions using the SharePoint, using like Microsoft Teams nowadays, things like that start to add real value to that license fee that you're now paying per month. So although there was a lot of technology around that, again, I was also looking at driving the adoption for these organisations and helping them move from on-prem and the way of working up into the cloud. So it was a really good experience. Although I'd had exposure to Microsoft 365 before, it hadn't been at this level and hadn't been at this kind of skill or responsibility level. You know, I was driving the technology piece and I was also driving the adoption as well. So there was lots of lessons learned with these and lots of different ways on how to interact with customers. And even as a consultant, all those customer service skills that I'd gained way back in that first level help desk call really helped me understand and the fears that people had and interact with them and understand the questions to ask, the questions not to ask, and just be able to reassure them about the journey. And as I was on the journey as well, it really helped them understand it as well. Now, we also had tons of Azure projects. So one day I walked into the office and my boss said, we're going to be delivering an IoT project. Now, I'll be honest, I don't even think back then when that project passed my desk, I knew what IoT meant, if I'm really honest. And I was a bit scared about what that meant and whether I'd be able to deliver that project or not. What that project was installing temperature sensors within a customer's fridge and being able to collect that data and report it so that their end users could query it whenever they needed to. And have access to it. They already had a solution in place, but it wasn't very robust. It would often go down, the server would often be restarted several times during the week, and every time the end users wanted access to the data, they had to log a help desk call and get the IT department to actually show them the data. So it wasn't very agile, wasn't very good, and very reliable. So we were going to put in this IoT project. Now, it was very scary. We did have lots of IoT sensors at the time scattered around our office, and we played with them and found out the different compatibilities, found the best ones that worked with Azure at the time. And there was also a lot of learning around how to make these temperature sensors push data into Azure, how to use Stream Analytics, how to then use Cosmos DB to store the data, and then visualize it as well. Power BI was something that I hadn't really used. I probably used it to view reports, but I hadn't used it definitely to build reports. And Cosmos DB, again, wasn't something that I was used to. I was more used to relational, I can't say that word, SQL databases and all the data that was stored in that and how all that worked and how you set up the tables and the databases in there. So there was definitely lots and lots of learning for me on this kind of project. Lots of late nights, lots of sitting on search engines trying to find the answers. And back then, the documentation wasn't as great. A lot of these services were brand new, so there wasn't as many blog posts from people doing hobby projects that I could actually learn from. So it was definitely a struggle, but in the end, we did deliver this project. It wasn't quite what we wanted, but at the end of the day, the data was getting pushed from these IoT sensors into Azure and then coming back out the end of Power BI for the end users. So we did deliver it, and I did feel a massive sense of relief and pride of being able to do this and being able to learn all of this, right? Because like I said at the start, I was really fearful about whether I was going to be able to learn all of this cloud stuff and be able to do the projects that customers were talking about and use the technology that was starting to come on board. But like I said, we ended up delivering this project and the customer was happy at the end of the day. So it was a great boost in my confidence to be able to learn these new technologies and have that project under my belt. So yeah, it was really a confidence booster for me and being able to understand that I could adapt, that even though these technologies were new and foreign to me, I could actually develop a project that delivered something using them. I'm not an IoT expert and I don't think I've really used it properly since then, but it's certainly something that I have knowledge of, I have a bit of exposure to, and if another one came up, I probably wouldn't be as scared if it landed on my desk nowadays. Now, another project that we had was for a customer who had offices based in different places of the world. So they had an office here in Scotland, they had offices in Dubai, and they also had one somewhere in Asia as well. And they were starting to look at what they could do with their backups and their disaster recovery plan. Contracts were running out with existing suppliers, and they were looking to do something a bit different. They had some issues with their backups, so they were doing backups to tape, which was fine in Scotland because the IT team were based here in Scotland, so they could be in charge of the tapes, they can change it, put in new ones, etc. And they also had a company that came and picked up those tapes, stored them somewhere safe, and then brought them back the next day or the next week. In the other locations, there was no IT support, so it was really dependent upon people in the office changing those tapes, storing those tapes, and it just wasn't going well. People were going off on holiday, people were forgetting about it, tapes were getting lost, tapes were getting broken, so there was big holes in their backup strategy, and they didn't really have a disaster recovery solution for the offices outside of Scotland. So they really wanted something that the IT department could manage and control and would be reliable for them. And that's where we started to leverage Azure Backup. Now, again, I'd never used Azure Backup before, but I'd done tons of backup projects before with various different systems. So I wasn't as scared about picking up this project. I had to do some knowledge transfer around Azure Backup, but fundamentally, backup is backup, right? We all know that you have to back it up daily, back it up weekly, monthly, yearly, and you have to, back it up outside of hours or so it doesn't impact your system. So a lot of that knowledge I was able to transfer. I was using a different bit of software to implement the backup, but at the end of the day, backup is backup, right? So I managed to deliver that side of the project really well for the customer. And they were happy that they could manage it, and going forward, it was actually going to be much better for them. In terms of the site recovery, we didn't really deliver what we should have, if I'm being honest. We were able to get disaster recovery up and running for the Glasgow office because of good connections with their internet pipe coming out of their office, and also because we had the UK data centres for Azure. In Dubai and in Asia, we had some issues around local data centres. We had issues with their internet connectivity not being very good out of their office, so we couldn't do the initial seed up into Azure to even get the disaster recovery in place. So at the end of the day, they ended up having a partially delivered project. But again, disaster recovery is something that we've probably all been involved in, either because we've had a disaster and we've had to implement that plan that was either half complete or was complete from someone else, or even implement it ourselves from the ground up. So again, different technologies were involved, but underneath was all the principles that I'd learned previously. So again, it wasn't a scary project, but it was a project that actually taught me that the skills that I have are transferable to the cloud. The things that I've learned, the things that I've invested in, the experiences I've had, I can take them into the cloud with me. I do have to adapt some things. Not everything's quite the same when you go to the cloud, but underneath, the valuable skills and experience that I have can be transferred into the cloud. Now, as I said, I was that engineer in that company that was the on-prem specialist, and the other engineer was the cloud specialist, and we helped each other. We were a mentor and a mentee at different times throughout the projects, throughout our days, and we helped each other guide along that. And I think that was key as well to helping me develop and helping him develop as well. So don't be frightened to help other people. Don't be frightened to accept experiences and help from other people. I think if you have a good working relationship, these kind of roles, these mentor and mentee roles, actually happen subconsciously anyway. So yeah, he definitely pushed me on and spurred me to learn more about the cloud and just to keep up, and gave me some tips on how to do that as well. And that's kind of where the Glasgow Azure user group came about. So in 2017, I formed the Glasgow Azure user group because I was starting to struggle a little bit because the documentation, like I said, wasn't great. There wasn't a lot of bloggers or talks being happened or conferences that I could access around all of this. And the nearest user group to me was down in London, which is several hundred miles away from me. So it was never going to be practical for me to actually go to that user group. So I started up my own user group, and we've been running for 3 years now. And it's been a great source of knowledge for me, both from presenting at it and hearing everybody talk as well, and learning about the different projects and where everybody's on their cloud journey. I don't think there's been a meetup where I haven't learned something, whether that be a feature has went generally available that I didn't realise, or big projects about learnings about how other companies have onboarded the cloud, how they've trained their staff, lots of different topics. So I really do, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here because you're all at a user group right now, but if you haven't attended a user group, or maybe this is your first one, please do look out for other user groups. I've compiled a list of ones that I know here on aka.ms/Azure Family. So please do check them out and see what other ones are running. Obviously, most user groups are running, or if not all, are running virtually. So we have the capability of attending a lot more if we wanted to nowadays. So I can't stress enough how valuable user groups have been to me in terms of upskilling and just learning new things and meeting some really cool people as well. Now, again, I am speaking at a PowerShell group, so I'm probably preaching to the choir, but PowerShell and coding and all of that kind of development stuff was definitely not my specialty. I didn't enjoy it at university. I loathed that class. I skipped it as many times as I could in order just to scrape a pass, and I avoided it for the majority of my career. A lot of what I did on-prem was all GUI driven. I didn't have to use code. Now that changed a little bit when Microsoft released Exchange 2007, and they took a lot of the interfaces and the ability to do some admin tasks out of the GUI, and I had to learn some PowerShell. So that was really my start of learning how to code and how to actually use it, and realise that I had to use it. But when I started looking at the cloud, obviously there's lots of different ways you can interact with the cloud. Azure has a portal and you can do a lot of things from there, which is great when you're learning it. But when you're starting to scale, deploying, several hundreds of servers, several hundreds of different services, and you're trying to make that reliable and easily repeatable, again, working within the GUI isn't always practical. So I had to learn how to really use PowerShell again, use bash commands, so the Azure CLI, and even delve into ARM templates as well. So again, this is where the relationship with my previous colleague helped. He was a Linux person. He was very much into bash and knew how to deliver services through that. And I was more the PowerShell person, even though it wasn't my specialty or forte. And we often would challenge each other to develop scripts, develop deployments of Azure services using our native kind of language. So I would do it in PowerShell, find any bugs, find any limitations, and he would do it in Linux or CLI. And then we would compare notes and we would swap it and we would learn from each other. And it was a great way to learn, because I actually think I probably use Azure CLI more to deploy stuff than I do PowerShell, because I find it a wee bit easier. You don't have to be experts in these things. I'm definitely not an expert, and sometimes I do have to go on a search engine to find out how to do things or what it meant. But as long as you're aware of some of these things, you can get by, and you understand the logistics and limitations of them and what they can do and what they can't do. Now, there's obviously a ton more of different ways you can deploy things. Terraform, Ansible, Chef, Puppet, all of those things. I keep to the core ones that are Microsoft centric, purely because trying to learn all of them isn't possible, unfortunately. But as long as you're aware of some of these technologies, again, like I said, the limitations and what they can and can't do, then you should be okay, and you should be able to find a suitable way forward for your organisation. Now, another thing that I never used, and I always thought was a developer-only tool, was Azure DevOps. And obviously Azure DevOps has changed its name. It used to be called VSTS. I had heard my colleagues using it, but again, it was the developers in my teams that were using this. But the more I heard people mention it, and the more I started to use the cloud, I realised I was going to have a look at what Azure DevOps was and start to figure it out, and again, understand what it did and what it couldn't do. So I started to teach myself, and some people say I've done this the really hard road, but my blog deploys through Azure DevOps. So I've taught myself how to build a repository to store all my blog code in. I've built a pipeline that takes in any changes from my GitHub, my repo, builds it and then deploys it out into my Azure web app. And I've got various different testing in there. Again, a bit of I learnt myself, but basically what I've got is a working pipeline within Azure DevOps that I now understand a bit more about, because I haven't just read about it, I've actually used it, and I have got a production, if you want to call my blog a production site, running on it. So I understand, again, the limitations, what it can't do. I'm not an expert, but I do have an appreciation of the tool, and I have used it. So yeah, there's parts of Azure DevOps that I haven't even delved into. I use the Azure DevOps boards to kind of track some tasks and stuff like that, although I'm not great at always remembering that the tasks are there and doing them. But again, like I said, I've been using it, and I have that production environment that I can test, and if someone talks to me about it, I understand the processes, and I haven't just read the documentation, I have some hands-on experience of it as well. Now, two tools that I'm quite passionate about nowadays, and again, these are tools that I used to say were developer only, and that's Git and GitHub. Again, I never thought I would have to touch these tools, and I didn't think they were anything that I really had to deal with. I touched GitHub a little over the years. As I said, I'd developed some PowerShell scripts for Exchange that I'd kept, and I was forever losing them because I couldn't remember whether they were on a OneDrive, if they were in, Dropbox, what PC they were stored on, or where that USB thumb drive was that actually had them on it. So I found GitHub that way, and I stored a lot of my scripts there, and they were just that handy repository for me to go and find something if I wanted that script. So I was using it at the very basic level, and it wasn't until, like I said, getting into the cloud that I really understood the power of Git and GitHub and how you can do some different things and how you can collaborate and find other people's code and kind of take inspiration from all of that. Now, GitHub has kind of grown arms and legs, shall we say, since I first discovered it. And you can now do things like deploy your code and then spin up resources in Azure. So I've got GitHub Actions, and I've got a repo that has a script that deploys a virtual machine in Azure, and the GitHub Actions actually pushes that through and initiates all of that. So there's definitely lots and lots of scope with GitHub. I do tend just to use it as a repository for storing code. I think I do have a website off the back of GitHub Pages, again, to try these tools and understand how I can leverage them. And Git is something that I use all the time to push up my code, pull down code. I've recently been working on using some Microsoft documentation and updating it, and all of that sits on Git. So I've been GitHub, sorry. So I've been using Git to pull the code, merge branches, create branches, do things I don't even understand I'm doing. But again, I know these tools exist, I know the use cases, and I can get by in making things work and do all of this. But I'm still learning, right? Every day is a challenge. Every day I'm having to learn. Every day I'm trying something new. I'm breaking stuff. I'm losing GitHub repositories because I've pressed the wrong command and everything's just been wiped out. All of this is very much still a journey. I'm still on that journey to figure out how I transition from being that on-prem engineer into the cloud engineer. But I'm getting there, and I'm loving the journey that I'm on. So all of this journey kind of accumulated in me joining Microsoft in 2018. I joined the customer success unit as a cloud solution architect, where I was working with big name customers, trying to onboard them into Azure as well. And that was a great opportunity. I'd always dreamed of working for Microsoft, or well, to be honest, my dream was always to be working for Bill Gates, but thinking about it back then, I probably didn't understand the company. But, I've really achieved that goal that I wanted to do. I'm working for Microsoft, I'm working for the company of Bill Gates. And it was a great learning curve for me. Like I said, I learned lots, and I was able to still do some projects. So like I said, one of the first projects I did was on cost management within Azure. I've also worked with customers on just doing backup projects, because again, they're trying to change what they do and trying to start the adoption journey. And often one of the projects that they start with is backup and disaster recovery. So again, very much within my comfort zone and pushing on the experience of other backup projects I've used with Azure. I've been able to take that. And although the customers that Microsoft deal with are slightly bigger than the MSP that I worked for in Glasgow are, I was able to transition and deliver some of those projects. In 2019, I actually changed role, so that's where I'm now a cloud advocate, and that sees me helping other people learn about the cloud journey. I do presentations, I attend conferences and user groups, and I also focus on storytelling or documentation, because let's face it, some of our documentation is fantastic, but it's quite dull to read occasionally. So having those stories, those use cases about how to use it and just making it come alive is part of my role as well. So I'm really enjoying being at Microsoft, and I'm still loving the journey that I'm on. I have got a lot of qualifications around Azure. I've got a lot of certifications. I've got the Azure Fundamentals ones, I've got the Architect ones, I've got the Administrator badges, I've passed these exams. Now, there's a big debate about how useful some of these exams are. I always say they are quite useful because they've taught me a lot when I've been studying for them. I realise that there's features and functionality that I didn't know, I hadn't used, and I get to learn about that and stretch myself as well. So the certifications are definitely a challenge, but I really encourage everybody to have a go at them, and they're great for showing that you have that knowledge, and hopefully your employer recognises them and helps support you as well on them. But for me, the certification badges are definitely something that I encourage you to do, and I've enjoyed and have really been beneficial to me as well. So keeping up to date can be a challenge. There's a lot of Azure out there. There's a lot of services. I think there's something like 150 odd different services, if not more, on Azure. And trying to keep up with that can be a bit of a challenge. What I do is I support and attend user groups where I can. Now, on screen, you'll see pictures of the ones that are in Scotland, the ones that are in Glasgow that I often attended in person when we could attend in-person events. But again, like I said, I really encourage you to support the local user groups and even stretch yourself now that most of them are virtual and go to other ones. They're a great place for learning, and they're also a great place for meeting people. I actually met the person that referred me into my first Microsoft job through the Glasgow Azure user group. So you really don't know who's attending these user groups, and how you can actually learn and grow your career as well. So tons of opportunities at these user groups. So and please don't feel like you have to go to the ones that are your specialty. I do attend the SQL One or the data conferences that happen within Glasgow often, even though that's not my specialist area, because I can often learn and hear and meet people that can help me when these future projects come on board as well. Now, another place that I learn and keep up to date is Twitter. Now, Twitter has its good and its bad points. On screen, you'll see some references to Twitter hashtags that I use to try and find people and the tweets that are happening. And often they can help me pinpoint news location, or again, they can help me see who's blogging about it, or even find user groups that I can attend and events that I can either attend or speak at and help other people. So definitely look at some of these. And again, there's some on there that are not necessarily my expertise or my area of expertise, but I like to keep an eye on what's happening and who are the people that I can go to when I have questions around SQL or databases or IoT or AI, etc. Another resource, and this is a bit of a shameless plug working for Microsoft, but Microsoft Learn is a great resource. It's a free resource and it gives you lots of information, lots of different modules that you can work through. And I love the gamification part of this. So every module and every unit that you complete, you get points and you can get badges towards all of that, and you can climb levels. So I know a lot of customers that actually make it into a little competition within their organisations where they say, this month have a look at studying for this level, and whoever has as many points at the end of the month gets a prize, whether that be a voucher for an online retailer or a restaurant or whatever. The small little token just to encourage people to actually use the platform and upskill. And I know in our team, we've had a bit of a competition over the last year to see who could actually complete Microsoft Learn. And I think it's the two Aussies in our team that have actually done that. So it's been good that way. We've all kind of pushed each other in a nice and kind of positive way to learn new things and to go outside of our comfort zones as well and to try it. So if you haven't tried Microsoft Learn, please do have a look at it. I actually recently used some of their courses to pass the Azure Data Fundamentals exam. So it does work, and they do align often to the exams as well. Now, something that one of my Microsoft colleagues has made in his own time is the Azure heat map, and it has a lot of resources actually, but the heat map is something that I use all the time. So if you go away on holiday or you're off for a few days, you can often come back to a deluge of alerts and you can miss some Azure news. Now, what my colleague here has done is built this great little tool where you can filter what's happened in the last 7 days. And in this example, you can see that the services that are lit up, so things like cost management or media services, have had an update in the last 7 days. So if you've been on holiday for 7 days and not kept up, you've been too busy reading your book, enjoying a cocktail or two, you can click on these different panels and then find out what that news update was. And again, you can filter it based on what your knowledge was or your specialty. So if you were a database person, you can look at all the databases there. There's lots of different features, and I think he's even added there's quizzes, there's highlights on what the SLAs are for some of the Azure services, what services are available for regions. So it's a great resource just to have a look at, but I mainly use it to keep up to date with what's been happening on a weekly basis, and I check it every Friday to see what's been happening. So in summary, I always tell people what you know if you're transitioning from someone who's traditionally an on-premise engineer into the cloud. What you know is still very relevant, and hopefully some of the stories I've told you can show you that and show you that it's not as scary to move to the cloud as you might think. Also, be open to new opportunities. And I think my IoT story is quite key here. I quite easily could have dodged that project. I could have taken a day off, sick or two, and completely missed some of the delivery of that project and not been the lead engineer on it. But I didn't, and I learned something new, and I built my confidence up. And although I'm not an IoT expert, and I'm probably never going down that route, I have had exposure to it and I understand it. So I have much more experience and, again, much more confidence of some of these cloud technologies, and I'm not frightened now to touch some of the newer ones that come on board. And with the plethora of services that we have available in the cloud now, what I say to people is find something you enjoy and learn it. You don't have to learn it all. You don't have to know every service in Azure. I certainly don't know every service in Azure. Often I have to go and read documentation or go and ask someone else. But what I do is I've found the stuff that I enjoy, the things that I am really good at, and built on that and just keep on doing that. I think in previous years, there's probably been a temptation to be a specialist or to be a generalist, sorry, in IT. And I think maybe that it's changing with the cloud, and we're going to have to look at being specialists in a certain area and then being able to work with other people to fill in the gaps that we don't have. But that's certainly my kind of thoughts on it. I'd be happy to hear what everybody else is thinking about it as well. So that's my kind of journey from pushing server cage nuts to pushing code. There's some resources on, if you follow that link, to find out more about the things that I've talked about, and some links that talk about it a bit more. And yeah, my contact details are there as well. And hopefully that was enjoyable. Thank you for having me. If you've got any questions or comments, please do let me know.
That was awesome. Thanks, Sarah.
No worries.
If you do have any questions, feel free to come off mute and speak up. Guess not. Yeah, no, I thoroughly enjoyed that. When I was when we were talking about presenting tonight, I remember specifically choosing this talk because I mean that's relevant, and I think a lot of the people here are either on that journey, are about to start that journey, or already have been there and have fond memories.
Yeah, I often think it's going to be harder for a lot of IT pros, for people that are, the traditional server huggers, for moving to cloud than, say, developers. But I don't know. That's just my thoughts on it. So I often like to share my story so that other people aren't as scared and aren't as intimidated by it. Because it is a bit scary not being able to just walk into the cupboard and see your servers and touch them and do stuff with them. And yeah, it's definitely, if you have to change, like me, from being a GUI person to someone that has to figure out what all these little brackets and commas and stuff do, again, it can be massively scary. But yeah, hopefully you can find a technology or a software or a coding solution that suits you and can work for you and just not be frightened anymore. But yeah.
Brett popped a message into chat. Do you
Mhm.
think there's going to be a time where it's absolutely fundamental to have to code?
I think potentially, yes. I think there'll be levels of coders. I think there'll always be people like myself who are the infrastructure person that builds up, the networking, the security, whatever it may be. So I think we're definitely, as persons of infrastructure, we're going to have to learn to code. I'm probably going to have to up my skills on PowerShell or ARM templates or whatever it may be. But I don't think I'm going to have to go full developer. So yeah, I think there'll be definitely, I'm definitely not in a rush to go and learn C# or any of that or whatever happens. But I think fundamentally we're all going to have to know some kind of coding at some level to do this. Because if you've ever deployed a virtual machine through the portal, it's great. But when you try and do 20 of them or 30 of them, it doesn't work. So being able to scale it through a bash script or a ARM template or Terraform is definitely something we're all going to have to be able to do. Yeah.
And Brett followed that up with a comment about Power Platform being good, but not necessarily for, like you're saying, the infrastructure folks.
Yeah, Power Platform's an interesting one. I've used it a few times to just do random things, like if a blog puts up a new post, it emails me, stuff like that. I haven't, and correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone's got any stories, but I haven't seen that many IT admins use it for any tasks yet. And I'd really be interested if people are using it to let me know, because that's definitely something I think we might have to be able to go down the road of using. But yeah,
I've used it, but it's mainly for stitching together different bits of PowerShell, like in Azure Automation.
Yeah, I've used it as sort of playing around with it. I've run into the same issues that I always run into with logic apps, and that the authentication mechanisms, because it's not, I don't like tying things to specific connections, whereas some authentication mechanisms, I have to authenticate as me, and I don't like having services out there that are dependent on me or my password expiring or so. But I do have some stuff which connects to SQL Server and bits and pieces in Power Platform, and it's good if you. I generally use it as a proof of concept to see if I can do something, and then end up putting it into Azure Automation or Azure Functions anyway. But I think it's a good middle ground. I think from an IT admin perspective, it's going to be one of those challenging things. And how do you keep tabs on who is doing what? It's basically saying, go and write all of this automation, and it takes you back to those VB script Excel things that you turn up in accounting that nobody knows how to support.
Yeah. There's definitely an element of that. And I think as IT pros or admins or people that are sometimes the custodians of these services, we definitely have to be aware of them, so that, like Brett says, we don't end up with a plethora of services our end users are put out there, and then we're left trying to support them when that person leaves or something breaks. Yeah, we definitely need to have that right bit of control, but not stop people from using these things. Is definitely something that we're going to have to figure out and learn.
Well, I had a quick question. Is there any basic stuff that in Azure that you should look at? Like when I play with admin stuff, there's like a few things that I would just learn to code basic function out of it and kind of build my skill set around that. In Azure, obviously a lot of that changes and how it functions as well. So like I think I've found out that the VM has custom scripts, and it's like an extension that operate quite different to how you would do in like how you like an on-prem admin person. So is there any advice you have from that perspective? I mean,
I think unfortunately it's just trial and error. I think one example is that we're probably traditionally using servers, and we use lots of group policy objects, GPOs, to manage servers, to install stuff on them, or change the clock or wallpaper or stuff like that. And there's an element of you want to do that in Azure, but there's different ways of doing that. And using something like custom scripts, obviously you could still use GPOs, but using custom scripts is maybe the way forward to do some of that. So, and there's probably about 6 other different ways you could probably do it as well.
Yep.
So I think it's trying all of them, figure out the limitations, figure out where they're good, and then figuring out even if you need to do any of that anymore. Do you need to change the background of your servers? Probably not. So is that a waste of time? Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah, because there's a lot of people are now doing a lot of applications, and they're still moving it from an on-prem over, and they haven't restructured it so that it fits the cloud. So then, I've been told to like install a whole bunch of software on it, and the only way I can think of doing that is custom scripts. But yeah, it's just trying to get that developer to change their mindset of how they've done it before, and it's a bit difficult sometimes. But like you said, it's a learning process, and I guess my experience with it is just start playing around with the on-prem stuff and trying to rethink how it fits in the cloud. So
yep, and not all services are going to be suitable for moving into the cloud or refactoring. You're still going to probably have some services that still need to run on virtual machines. I've had customers move their whole data center as virtual machines purely because of a time scale. They had an exit date and they couldn't refactor and stuff like that. And now they're on that refactor journey. So they've had to do a 2-step journey, but it's all about that journey, right? Right now you might not know all of the cloud functionality and all the services and be confident about managing that, about running that and being controlling that budget. So there's nothing wrong with moving your virtual machines from on-prem into the cloud, right? And then spending the time learning about it. Once you're a bit more confident about Azure, a bit more confident about running it, everybody knows how things run, and and they know that's the direction that you're going from. So everybody's got a different journey, and I definitely am one of those people that say no journey is the wrong journey. It's just about learning as you go, and fingers crossed everything goes right.
Yeah, I think I'm the same. I'm kind of like just mucking around with stuff and just find any opportunities just to automate some stuff out, and kind of been doing stuff like that. But when it comes to the Azure stuff, some of the things are slightly different, and just like you said, there's 100 ways to do it, and you got to pick one.
Yep.
That's cool. Thanks. It was a great talk.
Thank you. I'm just reading some of the comments here. Yeah, Brett's making some good comments in the comments around automation and DSC and image builder and stuff like that. There's tons of stuff you can use. Yeah, but don't be frightened. I think there's an element of being frightened of some of these, because you look at it and there's 6 or 7 different ways, or 10 different ways of doing it. Pick one. If it works, great. If you find that it doesn't work, go and use another one. Don't be frightened to change that process and learn and iterate with it. And as new services come on board, maybe that's better to use it. I think image builder's fairly new, so that's something that if you haven't used, give it a try. Could be good, could be rubbish, and then evaluate it and figure out what ways forward. But yeah, and I'm definitely not someone that says go and use the new and shiny thing just because it's new and shiny. If you've got a working process, you're comfortable with it, stick with it until it breaks. We deprecate it, something else comes along. You don't have to keep chopping and changing just because you meet someone at a user group that chops and changes and they're telling you it's something new. So as well.
That's how I do. I failed to success. So.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll try some of those out. The automation and the DSC. I haven't really played with that, but yeah, even image shooter. Cool.
I think DSC, even in an on-premises environment, is a lot of people's first foray into configuration management. And it all depends on your org. I mean, when I first got into cloud, it was in a hybrid environment. So we had ExpressRoute, and Azure was just being used as an extension of on-premises. We were still using AD domain joined VMs and group policy for the most part, but we started branching out, and rather than using Azure Automation, we had a pull server and then started writing configurations, and then you quickly run into paralysis because you realize that every server you've got is a pet. So writing any kind of configuration which can apply to everything is nigh on impossible. But it's just a case of starting and then iterating on that, like you said, Sarah, and you've just got to start somewhere. And until you start, it's a lot of information overload. Hi. Sorry, I've got a baby invading the room. But it's just a case of starting, and I think with Azure free services and Microsoft Learn, like you mentioned, there's some good modules on there. Set up a free Azure account, and there's some free services in there which you can get started with if you're not able to do that as part of your work. Hi.
Yep.
And even the labs through Microsoft Learn as well. Because of course, a lot of them spin up real Azure instances to go through the lab, and they're really good for getting some hands-on.
Yeah, I started the sandbox stuff that you get as part of the Learn modules is pretty good as well. And it gives you free access to play around for a limited duration.
Yeah, I've actually been studying for the AI fundamentals exam and using some of the Microsoft Learn stuff, and it's been able to spin up some of the analytics stuff that I have no idea about, but it tells me the exact, click here, here's some demo data, how you can push it through. So it's really good that way, because I could spin up a service in Azure and I could spin up one of those analytics thing, but then it's like, right, I need to go and make some data, or I need to go and find some dummy data, whereas the Microsoft Learn module gives me all of that and tells me how to do it. So I learn about it much more quickly because I'm actually, I have to step by step and everything's just there.
Well, I think our questions have died down a little bit, so I'll stop the recording.